You disappeared, not dramatically, not with an announcement. You just slowly stopped showing up, stopped responding, stopped participating in the life everyone expected you to live. And now people are worried. They text asking if you're okay. They say you've changed, that you're isolating, that it's not healthy to spend so much time alone. But here's what they don't understand. You're not running away from something. You're running toward something, and what you're running toward requires silence, space, distance from the noise that's been drowning you for years. Jung saw isolation differently than most people do. He didn't see it as withdrawal or depression or giving up. He saw it as a necessary stage of becoming, a return to yourself after years of being shaped by everyone else's expectations. Most people think isolation makes you weaker, smaller, more fragile, but Jung understood that for some people, isolation is where the real power begins, not the power to dominate or control or perform, the power to know yourself so deeply that no one can tell you who you are. This is about the psychology of isolation as transformation, and why the people who judge you for disappearing have never been brave enough to do it themselves. There's a difference between isolating because you're broken and isolating because you're done being broken by other people. Jung understood this distinction, even if the world doesn't. When you isolate, you're not abandoning connection, you're abandoning performance. You're stepping away from the version of yourself that only exists in relation to other people's needs, opinions, and expectations. That version of you is exhausting. It smiles when it doesn't want to. It explains itself constantly. It manages other people's emotions. It shrinks so others feel comfortable. It's always on, always performing, always trying to prove it's enough. And at some point, you realize that version isn't you. It's a construction, a mask you've been wearing for so long you forgot it wasn't your face. And isolation is what happens when you finally take the mask off and realize you don't even know what's underneath. So you disappear, not forever, not from everyone, but from the context that required the mask, from the people who only knew the performance, from the life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And in the silence, something begins. It's uncomfortable at first. You're alone with thoughts you've been outrunning for years, alone with emotions you buried under busyness, alone with the gap between who you've been and who you actually are. But if you stay there, if you don't run back to the noise, something shifts. The isolation stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like space. Space to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, want your own things without needing permission or validation or applause. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming a distinct individual rather than a reflection of the collective. And individuation can't happen in the crowd. It requires solitude, not as punishment, as prerequisite. You weren't born afraid of isolation, you were taught to fear it. Maybe your family treated solitude like punishment, sent you to your room when you were bad, made time alone feel like exile, so you learned that being alone meant something was wrong with you. Maybe you grew up watching people use isolation as a weapon, the silent treatment, exclusion, being left out while everyone else was included, so you learned that being alone meant rejection, that it was something shameful, something to avoid at all costs. Maybe school taught you that sitting alone at lunch was social failure, that not having weekend plans meant you were a loser, that your worth was measured by how many people wanted to be around you. And then social media made it worse. It turned connection into performance and isolation into evidence that you were falling behind. Everyone else seemed surrounded by people, by experiences, by proof that they mattered, and you learned that being alone meant being invisible, that if you weren't constantly connected, you didn't exist. So you stayed busy, stayed social, stayed surrounded by people even when being around them felt like slowly drowning, because being alone felt worse. It felt like admitting defeat, like proving that you were exactly as worthless as you feared. But Jung would say you've confused isolation with abandonment, and they're not the same thing. Abandonment is what happens when others leave you. Isolation is what happens when you leave them. And leaving, even when it looks like loss, can be the most powerful thing you ever do. Because what you're leaving isn't connection, it's the price you've been paying to maintain connection. The constant self-erasure, the perpetual performance, the exhaustion of being someone you're not so other people will let you stay. Here's what isolation looks like when it's transformation instead of collapse. You stopped going to things you don't want to go to, stopped saying yes when you meant no, stopped showing up for people who never showed up for you, and at first it felt cruel, selfish, wrong, but then it started feeling like relief. You deleted people not angrily, just quietly, unfollowed accounts that made you feel inadequate, stopped texting people who only reached out when they needed something, let friendships that were held together by history and guilt finally die, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was clean. You spend more time alone now, and it doesn't feel lonely the way people warned you it would. It feels like finally being able to hear yourself think, like finally having room to feel what you actually feel instead of what you're supposed to feel. You've stopped explaining yourself. When people ask why you're not around as much, you give vague answers. You're busy, you need space, you're working on things. You don't owe them the truth, which is that being around them was costing you more than it was giving you, and you're done paying that price. You've noticed that your tolerance for bullshit has disappeared. You can't do small talk anymore, can't pretend to care about things that don't matter, can't sit through conversations that feel like performance rather than connection. So you just don't, and people think you've become difficult, cold, withdrawn, but really you've just stopped pretending. And here's the strange part: you're not weaker, you're stronger, clearer, more certain about who you are and what you want. The isolation didn't diminish you, it concentrated you. It burned away everything that wasn't actually you and left something solid behind. Jung would say there's a shadow side to isolation, a part you don't want to look at but need to. The shadow here holds your fear that maybe everyone was right, that maybe you are broken, that maybe you're not choosing solitude, you're just too damaged to connect, that the isolation isn't transformation, it's avoidance. And if you're honest, there are moments when you believe that. There are nights when the silence feels less like peace and more like proof that no one actually wants you. When you scroll through photos of people together and feel that sharp twist of exclusion. When you wonder if you made a mistake, if you pushed away people who actually cared, if you're going to end up alone forever because you were too proud or too scared or too broken to let people in. And the shadow holds your rage too, at the people who made you feel like you had to choose between being yourself and being loved, at the world that punishes authenticity and rewards performance, at yourself for taking so long to realize you didn't have to keep playing a game you were never going to win. It holds your grief for the friendships you've lost, for the version of yourself that could still show up to things without feeling like you were betraying your own needs, for the simplicity of belonging somewhere even if that belonging required you to disappear. And it holds your fear of what comes next, because isolation gives you clarity but it doesn't give you direction. You know what you don't want, you know who you're not, but figuring out what you do want and who you are, that's harder. That requires building something instead of just tearing things down. And building is terrifying because it means risking connection again, risking being seen again, risking that the new version of you might be rejected just like the old one was. The shadow doesn't make isolation wrong, it just makes it complicated, and complications are where the real work lives. Here's what happens when isolation becomes permanent instead of transitional. You stop growing, isolation gives you space to shed what doesn't serve you, but at some point you have to build something new, and building requires input, feedback, friction, challenge. If you stay isolated too long, you stop evolving. You crystallize, you become so rigid in your solitude that anything outside it feels like a threat. You mistake clarity for completion. In isolation, you see yourself clearly, maybe for the first time, but clarity isn't the end goal, it's the beginning. You're supposed to take that clarity and do something with it, test it against the world, let it be challenged and refined and deepened. If you don't, the clarity becomes dogma, and dogma, even personal dogma, is just another prison. You confuse independence with invulnerability. Isolation teaches you that you can survive alone, that you don't need people the way you thought you did, and that's true, but it's also incomplete, because not needing people isn't the same as not wanting them, and if you're not careful, you'll turn survival into identity. You'll become the person who doesn't need anyone, who can't be hurt because they won't let anyone close enough to hurt them, and that's not strength, that's a different kind of fear. You lose your capacity for intimacy. Real intimacy requires vulnerability. It requires letting someone see you, not just the parts you figured out, but the parts that are still confused and messy and uncertain. Isolation protects you from that risk, but it also costs you the possibility of being known, and being known is one of the only things that makes being human bearable. Jung believed that individuation wasn't about separation from others. It was about becoming so solid in yourself that connection no longer required self-betrayal. But you can't get there by staying isolated forever. At some point you have to risk connection again, not from the old place of performance and people-pleasing, from the new place of knowing who you are and trusting that's enough. Here's how you use isolation as transformation instead of escape. First, name what you're actually doing. You're not isolating because you hate people. You're isolating because you need to remember who you are without them. That distinction matters. One is permanent withdrawal. The other is temporary recalibration. Know which one you're doing. Second, set a container for it. Isolation without boundaries becomes avoidance. Tell yourself this is for 6 months, a year, until you've finished a specific project or worked through a specific question. Give it structure, because open-ended isolation becomes a default, and defaults are hard to break. Third, stay in your body. Isolation makes it easy to live entirely in your head. You think and think and think and convince yourself that thinking is the same as living. It's not. Move, go outside, feel your body in space, because transformation isn't just cognitive, it's somatic. And if you're only changing your mind without changing how you inhabit yourself, you're not actually transforming. Fourth, document the process. Write, record voice memos, draw, track what you're learning about yourself in isolation, not for anyone else, for you, because the insights you have in solitude are slippery. They feel profound in the moment but evaporate when you re-enter noise. Documentation makes them solid, makes them something you can return to when the world tries to convince you that who you were pretending to be was who you actually are. Fifth, prepare for re-entry. Isolation isn't the end state, it's the preparation for a different kind of connection. One where you don't betray yourself to belong, but you can't just show up in the world as this new version of yourself without strategy. People will expect the old you. They'll be confused or threatened or dismissive when you're different. You need to be ready for that, ready to hold your ground without needing them to understand. Here's what Jung understood that most people are too afraid to test. Real power doesn't come from being needed. It comes from knowing you don't need to be needed, and you can't learn that in the crowd. You can only learn it in isolation. The crowd will always tell you who to be. It has to. That's how crowds work. They require conformity to function. They require you to play a role, fill a need, serve a purpose. And as long as you're in the crowd, you'll believe that's what you are. A role, a function, a reflection of what others need from you. But in isolation, you discover something the crowd can't teach you. You discover that you exist even when no one's watching, that your thoughts matter even when no one hears them, that your life has meaning even when it's not being validated or witnessed or applauded. And that's terrifying because it means everything you've been doing for approval, for belonging, for proof that you matter, all of it was optional. You didn't need it. You just thought you did. And now you have to decide whether you're going to go back to pretending or whether you're going to live from this new knowing. Most people can't handle that decision, so they never isolate long enough to face it. They stay in the noise. They keep performing. They keep believing that connection is the same as being seen and being seen is the same as mattering. But you know different now. You've been alone long enough to realize that solitude isn't loneliness, that isolation isn't weakness, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is disappear until you remember who you are without an audience. You isolated and people judged you for it. They said you were running away, giving up, becoming cold and closed and difficult. But Jung understood what they don't. Isolation isn't retreat, it's return. It's the act of going inward so deeply that when you come back out, you're no longer willing to live on anyone else's terms. The people who think isolation makes you weak have never been strong enough to choose it. They've never been brave enough to sit alone with who they actually are instead of who they perform as. So here's the truth. You didn't isolate because you're broken. You isolated because you're finally ready to stop breaking yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. And that's not weakness. That's the beginning of power.